My name is Dion Filmer. I'm the director of the research department here at the World Bank, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session on the determinants and impacts of redistributive land reform. We've got 4 really interesting papers. I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to dedicate half an hour to each paper, 20 minutes presentation, and then 10 minutes sort of Q&A discussion. And we'll do each paper in sequence. So we're going to kick it off with Cory Smith from the University of Maryland, who's going to present his paper on land concentration and long-run development in the frontier United States.
All right, well, thanks so much to the organizers for having me. Really psyched to be here. This is a bit of an old paper, but it's economic history, so I guess that sort of goes without saying. All right, so this paper is going to take us back to a time when the U.S. was really an agrarian economy. And I probably don't need this bit of motivation, but just to remind us, in agrarian economies, land is one of, if not the most important productive assets. So the question of who gets how much land is one of first-order importance. And as I'm also sure we're going to hear a lot about today in this session, just a basic fact of life is that in most contexts in the world, land ownership is not evenly distributed, and a lot of it is concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. We often think of sort of the very biggest landowners as landlords. They're people who rent out to tenant farmers and are paid either in cash or maybe a share of the output in a crop share agreement or sharecropping. This contrasts a bit with, sort of lower down on the distribution, where many people are sort of small-scale owner-operators, people who own and work their own lands. And it's a very old question about how this distribution of land might affect economic output. The debate isn't just old because this paper is old. This goes back at least to Adam Smith. And, for all that he's associated with the right wing in the modern day, I think on this topic he actually sounds pretty left-wing. Speaking about the landowning aristocrats of his day, he wrote that, very rarely are these folks good at improving their properties. And what he pointed to were the classic contracting frictions in these share agreements. So, if you only get a fraction of the output, what's your incentive to actually put in a lot of your time and effort and resources in developing the property? And of course, you can take much more modern books. I picked How Asia Works just because I enjoyed the book. But you can see very similar arguments even several hundred years after he was writing. But of course, just because Adam Smith said something doesn't mean that we have to accept it at face value, and you could adopt the opposite perspective. It's possible we do want to encourage certain amounts of land concentration to take advantage of economies of scale. Or, we could adopt a more Coasian perspective. If markets are working well, and hopefully in the United States we like to think that they're working pretty well, it shouldn't really matter how land is distributed. Eventually land will go to the optimal owner. So, looking at the distribution is sort of a second order or kind of missing the main piece of the story. Now, we do have some evidence on the impacts of shared tenancy, but a lot of this has been very short run, sort of focused on the effort that's put in maybe one planting season or something like that. Whereas Adam Smith really highlighted the topics of investment and development over very long run periods. And it's much harder to get statistical identification for this type of time frame. What you'd really want is some historical episode that varied amounts of land concentration in comparable pieces of areas, and then you'd want to fast forward the clock many years to see what happens to those lands. So that's going to be the goal of the paper today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that U.S. land policies put in place in the American West actually lead to essentially random variation in levels of land concentration. This comes from a strange policy arrangement where 2 different policies were applied in alternating square miles of land in a pattern that some people liken to a chessboard or a checkerboard. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to study the effects of the policy both historically in the late 1800s and in the modern day, roughly 150 years later. So that's the long-run aspect. All right, what am I going to find? Well, it's going to turn out that land concentration in this setting leads to lower rates of investment historically, and that actually translates into lower land values as measured in the modern day. So there's clearly evidence of a lot of persistence here, but I'll also show you that there's evidence for convergence. The historical impacts based on available archival data were much larger. I'll discuss the mechanisms very briefly, mostly focusing on the sort of classic frictions in share tenant agreements as the main reason. And then I'll discuss very briefly just the rates of convergence and show that this is a slow and steady dynamic. There's not sort of one point where everything switches to a new equilibrium, but instead we have a slow market-based reallocation that slowly undoes the differences and the importance of the initial allocation. So, overall, we should take this as support for Adam Smith's views, but over a very long period as sort of the new novel fact. All right, probably not time for a detailed literature review, but there's a lot of really good work that this paper builds off of. I hope you come away with this talk thinking about connections to sort of the optimality or not of shared tenancy in general, and of course questions on land distribution and tenancy reform. The one twist here is that this is sort of a pre-distribution, not a redistribution of land, but I think that's also something we should learn about as well. And finally, if nothing else, I hope this can be a contribution to the economic history of the US. The two policies that I study allocated roughly a quarter of the US landmass to different individual owners, so I think they're important to study in their own right. Okay, just a little bit about the historical background. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to contrast two different land policies that took place in the American West or the American frontier. The first one is pretty well known. This is the Homestead Act of 1862. And the basic goal here was to get land into the hands of ordinary people, small-scale owner-operators. And it did this by giving people who were willing to live and work on the land the title for essentially free. And classically about 160 acres. Now, for folks who work in developing countries today, 160 acres sounds absolutely huge. But if you go back in time, the differences were actually between the US and other countries were actually a lot smaller. Not necessarily zero, but we should think of 160 acres as a typical size for an individual family. The second policy I'm going to study is a little less well known. This policy is known as railroad land grants. And what we should think is that, this is the era when the United States is trying to encourage a lot of railroad construction. But many railroad companies were not paid in dollars and cents, but rather in thousands of square miles of land. So these were in-kind payments that the railroad companies were then supposed to sell off in order to, sort of balance their budget. And the railroad companies didn't have any notions about, small-scale farmers should get it, the type of person who should get it. This is a classic auction. So there's no restriction on size, and typically the people who can afford to give a lot of cash for land are looking to buy pretty large properties. So as a result, the railroad land grants led to a fairly high level of land concentration. You can sort of see that in many historical quotes, kind of at the bottom, describing the railroad land grants. Their sale policies led to large-scale purchases and high rates of tenant farming in the areas. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to evaluate these policies in just like 5 or 6 states where I could get some good data on modern land values. And just the one thing to note here is that these policy areas cover huge fractions of these states. This isn't sort of just the land that the railroad is operating on. These are really, massive amounts of in-kind payments in thousands of square miles of land. All right, now the other thing that we need to know is that most land in the United States, especially the US West, is divided up into a square grid known as the Public Land Survey System. So if you've ever flown over Nebraska or Kansas or something and wondered why you see a lot of square farms and square counties, this is basically the reason. The main unit of this grid is known as a township. It's a 6 by 6 mile square, and every square mile within that is termed a section and gets an ID number 1 to 36 in this regular pattern you can see here. Now, the fun thing for an econometrician or an applied economist here is that railroad companies only get squares that have an odd ID number. That is, they get squares 1, 3, and 5, but 2, 4, and 6 continue to be reserved for small-scale ownership under the Homestead Act. So the sort of natural experiment here is that, this even or odd status is some weird quirk of how, the survey grid was drawn many years before the land was given out. And so within the policy area, I should be able to compare even and odd without fear of omitted variables. On the other hand, the even or odd status did influence levels of land concentration. So this is like a qualitative version of that, but you can see in a lot of the odd numbers, those are the red, that we have one person holding 1 square or more. That's large even for the US. That's a square mile, 640 acres. whereas most of the blue squares are divided up into these standard 160-acre parcels reflective of the Homestead Act. And I should say this is measured already a generation after the initial allocation. So clearly there's some persistence already. All right, a little bit more about kind of the main data set, and then I'll show you some balance checks before we get into the main results. The specification here is going to be really, really simple. The unit of analysis is going to be one of these squares, and I'm going to regress a particular outcome on a dummy equal to 1 if it's an odd-numbered square. That means higher rates of historical land concentration. I'll throw in some controls for power, and then the main specifications are going to have Conley standard errors, just because this is a spatially regular pattern. All right, here's sort of the balance check, and you can see kind of on a wide range of geographic or other types of outcomes, there's really no differences between these even and odd sections. Typically for like the first 4 columns, there's a difference of 0.1% of a standard deviation or less. So, I hope this sort of demonstrates that, this even or odd difference really didn't mean anything except in terms of determining who got the initial allocation of land. All right, so for outcome data, I'm going to be looking at a lot of property assessments. Those are most extensive for the modern period, and I'm going to learn things like the value of the land and the types of investments on it. To get some historical flavor, I'm going to collect similar data, but for the early 1900s. It's not going to be as geographically extensive, but it's going to help me comment on mechanisms in convergence. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that this even-odd difference is as good as random. And now we can look at the causal effects of historical land concentration. And as I promised, I'll show you that there's lower rates of investment initially, and these translate into lower land values in the modern period. So I'm going to start off with investment, and my main measure here is going to be what's known as land improvement. You can think of this as, the farmer has taken a lot of time and energy to take an open stretch of prairie and upgrade it to start growing crops. So there's good returns for that, but it takes a lot of effort. The first measures I'm going to show you date from the early 1900s, and in red here we have the odd-numbered squares. These are the more concentrated ones. And you see pretty low rates of investment by this measure, regardless of the land quality, which is measured on the x-axis. In contrast, if we go over to the even numbers, the small-scale owners, what we see is that there's both higher rates of investment overall, and the pattern actually is much more reflective of comparative advantage. That is, it's really the best pieces of land that are developed to grow crops. And there's sort of a flat or almost flat curve for the odd-numbered sections. Okay, well, one thing I can do is now I can just fast forward the clock 100 years and see what happens to these areas. And you see a couple of things. First, clearly there's been a lot of convergence. The two types now are almost identical. But the convergence isn't necessarily somewhere in the middle. In fact, they've more or less converged to what the small-scale holders were doing in the early 1900s. So, in other words, being initially allocated to a concentrated ownership actually delays investments for a long period. You can actually see that in most places the red line is a little bit below the blue line, which implies that the convergence is still not complete. So they're still lagging a little bit behind in this measure. All right, that was just one measure of investment. There's a number of others in the paper, which I kind of summarize in this graph. This grows crops is the land improvement measure I already showed you. Assessors often measure the value of investments or improvements in a property. And then I can also look at population, which we can think of as a proxy for labor input on the particular square, since historically and even nowadays, most of the people who are working on a piece of land actually are going to be the ones working on it. And each of these outcomes has 3 bars. The first one is some historical sample. The second bar is that same sample in the modern day. And then the third bar is sort of a very large modern sample, which is going to be statistically more precise. And in each case, you see the same pattern. There's a large negative effect on the intensity of land use historically. That effect is still negative, but shrunk in the modern day. And it's statistically precise if you expand out to the modern sample. All right, so that brings us to the question of land values, which I've sort of measured the effects of here, again, as a function of land quality. And what you can see is that in the typical square mile of land, somewhere around 5% of the land value is lost as a result of historical concentration. Now, 5% isn't necessarily huge, but then again, we're only talking about the initial owner from 100 or 150 years ago. So from that perspective, actually, this is a significant amount of value lost due to a policy that took place long before any of us were born. There's a little bit of heterogeneity, but nothing super much to write home about. Maybe sort of the very worst pieces of land nobody takes the time to invest in, so there's no effect there. All right, last piece of causality here is that one fun thing about this setting is that, you saw in the earlier map, these policy areas don't cover the whole country. So I can look at places outside of the grant policy areas and compare even and odd squares. And on the dimension of land value, you find basically a whole bunch of zeros all across the board. So this is sort of another piece of evidence as a placebo check that this is really the causal effect of the initial allocation rather than some other weird feature of the grid or something like that. Okay, in the last few minutes, I'm going to touch very briefly on mechanisms. And like I said, I'm going to be talking a lot about the incentive problems in share tenancy. So in classic economic theory, share tenancy or these share agreements are the ones where the incentive effects really come in. They dilute the marginal return for effort for sort of everybody involved. Classically the tenant, but it could be the principal too. However, in some areas of the country and the world, tenants have enough resources to pay their landlord a fixed cash rent. And in classic economic theory, you wouldn't expect to see any incentive effects from that. And that's more or less what I find here. So what I've done here is I've split up the sample into different groups of US counties and then sort of charted the effect on those groups by the fraction of tenant agreements that operate under share versus cash. And what you see is that in counties where share agreements are really common, you have the most negative effects. But in counties where most tenants are able to sort of get the resources for cash rent, you see small and maybe even zero effects. So that's very consistent with the classic theories of Marshall, but again with the twist that this is about long-run outcomes, not just the short-run effort. Finally, I just wanted to give a small flavor for how convergence operates in this setting. This is a measure of land concentration for one archival data set where I'm able to get more or less panel data on ownership. And what you see is the differences in the even and odd squares start off really large and start shrinking fairly slowly over time. So this is definitely some support for the Gaussian convergence prediction in the sense that we see that convergence is happening and it's happening in the right direction. But it's not necessarily some instantaneous process. There's not some magic event that precipitates a new, more adjusted equilibrium that undoes the importance of the initial allocation. This is just the slow path of the market operating over time. All right, so that's, I think, kind of the big results from this paper. Of course, there's a lot more if you look in the full version. But let me just conclude. So, broadly, this paper has been concerned with the question of what are the long-run effects of land concentration. And consistent with a lot of classic theory, they seem to be negative, at least for the measure of economic development that I use, land value. So land concentration lowers investment historically, and the market seems to be working to undo the importance of this initial allocation, but this is a process that really takes many generations, and in fact hasn't even completed after over a century. There's a lot more in the paper. I sort of delve into these mechanisms a little more, look at some other fun heterogeneity analyses. I try and do a bit more to reject individual alternatives. But for now, let me just conclude that, if nothing else, I hope this paper can give us a somewhat more nuanced view of the American frontier. It's often mythologized as an area just full of sort of the independence of the pioneers, small-scale owner-operators, and those people were certainly there. But the reality is that land ownership patterns in this context were much more mixed and featured high levels of land concentration, which, unfortunately to say, seems to have lowered the economic development in those regions in ways that are even apparent into the modern day. All right, so I think that's the main set of things I wanted to show you. Really looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks, Cory. Should we just take a couple of questions, and then if we have time, we'll do a second round?
Very interesting project. As I mentioned before, I was writing the paper beforehand. One question about like other outcomes that you can look at, and I'm curious about land use and whether or not these different squares have been behaving differently even today, the type of crops that they are growing, etc. And second question is related to the political economy, given that we are going to be talking about politics later. Have you seen any effects of this division on political outcomes? Yeah, thanks.
Should we collect or shall I?
Let's just see if there's anybody else who has a question. Otherwise, okay, go ahead.
Perfect. Yeah, okay. So let me just answer the first question. Yeah, I showed you growing crops versus not. That's kind of the leftmost thing here. Conditional on growing crops, I don't think there's too much going on. So I think the main thing is, the big investment in your land historically is, do you kind of take this prairie and do you, spend the time and effort to develop it to grow crops? The alternative is sort of like cattle ranching or just, letting it run wild. And I think that's kind of the big decision. Conditional on that, if you take that effort, I don't see much difference in you grow corn or wheat or something like that. Political outcomes, there's a little bit in the paper on this, and that's one thing that didn't fit in here. I should say this is not necessarily the optimal design to do that for the following reason, that if you really want to look at maybe GE outcomes, and this is a parcel of land unit of analysis. That said, you can look for a few different types of outcomes here. One is whether or not there's like a school on the property. And sort of adjusting for this population effect I showed you here, there's basically no differences. So that's maybe a very, narrow version to say that in this context, the political effects aren't large. But again, that's measured at the sort of the farm level, maybe not at the, county level or state level or something like that. And economic historians or historians tend to say there are effects on that level. Perfect. Yeah, we've got it.
Especially with your results about sharecropping, can you speculate a little about the role of race?
Yeah, so I should say maybe one other limitation of the paper is that on the typical parcel of land here, we're talking about something like 90% of folks are white. There is one southern state here, which is Florida, but that fact is still true, even though Florida overall is diverse if your unit of analysis is a piece of land. So I think you might find different effects, particularly on the political economy end, with a similar design, but focused on parts of the country where there's a bit more racial diversity. I don't want to try and extrapolate too much, given the the limited diversity here. Yeah.
Thanks for the project. It's fascinating. Just trying to be provocative.
Sure.
I'm thinking about the fragmentation of property rights in other contexts is usually inefficient. So I'm very much convinced of what you show, but just as a mental experiment, is it possible that there are situations in which concentration of property rights, large-scale possession, facilitates certain types of projects? And I'm just looking at your slide and saying, well, modern technologies make larger properties probably more profitable even in crop cultivation.
Yeah, so I think there's certain ways to answer that question. I don't want to say this is the only paper you should ever think about for economies of scale. Let's see if I have it somewhere here. All right. Yeah, so one thing to say is that you could have imagined there's some subsample where the effects go the opposite way. Really, and so this sort of splits it up by state, and different. Again, on land quality is the x-axis, so we can think of this as like geography times land quality subsamples. And there's certainly some areas of the country where the effect is zero. Usually, these are places where essentially no small-scale owner could really make a go of things. So maybe from that perspective, even though we don't see differences, you could say, well, maybe there's some evidence for scale economies. But, considering all the comparisons here, you really don't find any places that obviously stand out as having positive effects. So to that extent, at least historically, I don't think there's great evidence for scale economies. Now, you could say, well, what if you redid the distribution in 2000 or 1980 or something? Or what if the homesteaders didn't get 160 acres? What if they got 16 acres? I think it's quite plausible that you would find a different result in those counterfactuals, but at least for the US, there's not, and in the time period I study, there doesn't seem to be good evidence of that. And at least in the classic correlational evidence, you really do see just kind of a consistent economy of scale for the farm size productivity relationship. So to that end, if you look at the natural experiment version, I think it is striking that you don't find too much positive to write home about. But again, with the caveat that I'm sure you could come up with some alternative context where it's true. Perfect, yeah.
So very nice, first of all.
Thank you.
Do you think that like the selection on who then gets the small plot or large plots matter? I guess the ideal experiment will be, you see who's interested in large plot in small plots, and then you re-randomize the ex post. Of course, you can't do that. But do you have names, for instance? Can you say something on characteristics?
There's a little bit of this. So I think there's two perspectives on this. One, and I think, by the way, both types of experiment are valuable. You could imagine taking, two different groups of people and randomly allocating them more versus less land. That would keep the identity fixed. But, and that's certainly valuable, and that's not quite what this does. On the other hand, we typically, if you think about, say, like a redistributive land reform, you're also changing not only the size, but the identity. So, it's also valuable to think, well, what happens when both go together? Because that's pretty policy relevant.
Yeah, sorry, I completely agree. Yeah. I wasn't making an identification question. I was just, do you think it plays a role in this section? And can you quantify?
It's an important point, because if we want to think about mechanisms, the identity might matter. Now, I don't have a strong way to disentangle those, but in general, the types of things you can observe about the folks who get the large plots of land you'd think they'd be positive. They tend to be wealthier and have access to more resources and a little bit more education. And that's not super surprising. These are people who have money to spend. So we'd normally think that would make it a bit more positive. But that's a qualitative answer with some limitations.
Okay, so if there are not any more questions, I think we can move to the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.
So next up we have Juan Felipe Riano from Georgetown University. Yeah, and he's going to talk to us about our land reform in Mexico. You have the clicker? Perfect.
Okay, can you hear me? Well, perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a pleasure to be here. My first time at the World Bank, so really excited about this. This is a joint work with Leopoldo Ferguson from Universidad de los Andes and Horacio Larregui from ITAM. The project is about political competition and state capacity. It happens to come from this evidence from the land reform program in Mexico. But now that I've seen all these papers, I think we should have been probably sell it in a different way as the consequences of political competition for state capacity, but with the flavor of land redistribution matters for state capacity. Anyways, so let me start right away with the broad motivation of the paper that was studying the determinants of state capacity in the context of clientelism. So I don't think I need to emphasize or sell this here. We know that state capacity is key for economic development, political stability, and democracy. And even though we know that this is the case and there's plenty of evidence about that, we still lack a convincing understanding of the modern determinants of state capacity. And this is especially true in clientelistic settings, quite common in low and middle income countries, in which these relationships between patrons and clients are quite common. Here, when I'm referring to clientelism, I'm referring to the specific form of relationship in which you have an exchange of goods, private or public goods, for political support. So what we ask in the paper is this very, quote-unquote, simple question: how does political competition influence state capacity building in the context of clientelism? So before I go into the details, let's think about what are the potential ways in which political competition could affect state capacity building. On one side, you can imagine that more political competition should enhance state capacity building and investments in state capacity because more voices are heard. There are more, let's say, demands from public goods. People ask for redistribution, and therefore, an increase in political competition should enhance state capacity building. On the other hand, however, if you are in a context where clientelism is ubiquitous, what could happen is that the clientelistic incumbent might feel threatened for the political competition, and in order to keep control of power, might deter investments in state capacity. Why? Because maybe this incumbent has the comparative advantage of being clientelistic and doesn't want to provide public goods and lose that comparative advantage. So the paper is about exactly that. And what we do in a nutshell is a paper with two main parts. One is a theoretical model in which we basically modify a probabilistic voting model. And we show basically that in the context of clientelism, when there is like kind of clientelistic incumbent, things could go wrong with political competition. Then we test that in the context of Mexico, and this land reform that occurred from 1910 to 1992. And the main theoretical argument that we are trying to make here is that if you take this standard probabilistic voting model and you add two additional assumptions. One, that the cost of providing public goods is decreasing in the level of state capacity, and that clientelistic incumbents have a comparative advantage in providing transfers instead of public goods. If you add only those two assumptions, you get two interesting results. The first one is that clientelistic parties might oppose to investments in state capacity or not, depending on certain parameters of the model. But when they oppose to state capacity, that's especially strong in places in which they face a strong political competition. So what we do is try to get that prediction from the model and put into the data, and we look at this land reform in Mexico when we show that the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI in Mexico, is strategically deterred state capacity building via a hero allocation, or this allocation of communal lands, where it started to experience more political competition. And that's basically the paper. That's the whole argument that I want to try to make today. So a bit of institutional background. So after the Mexican Revolution in 1910, the new constitution in Mexico started with this idea of a broad land reform through the allocation of common land or common property rights in lands across the whole country. This redistribution of land accounted for more than 50% of the agricultural land in the country. And this was central for the consolidation of the PRI as the hegemonic party over the years. So basically the idea is that people demand land. What I can do now is decide where to provide it and when exactly to do so. And in that sense, the PRI, the party, selected not only the location, but the timing of that new land grant. Okay? So this tied the communities to the state and to the politicians because they cannot use the land as a collateral. Not for credits, agricultural credits, not for investments. So they basically depend on the politician in turn to get those investments. So here, what we are trying to claim is that the proximity to municipality heads of these land plots was a key determinant of the administrative capacity. So if I want to give you electricity, water, etc., it's going to be harder for me to do so if you are really far away. So what we are saying is that because they were deciding where exactly to locate, that they were affecting basically the cost of providing public goods in T and in T+1, but also the credibility for the opposition to provide public goods in the future. So if you are really, really far away, what is going to happen is that if the opposition say, don't worry, I'm going to provide electricity, it's very unlikely that that's actually the case. So we're going to say that basically if we look at the distance, the location of these ejidos from municipality heads as a choice of state capacity by the PRI, we can get very interesting results. So how political competition enters into the picture. So the PRI was essentially uncontested from 1920 to 1950s. They were the only party. All the elections that they ran, they won by basically 99% against one, something like that. But in the 1950s, what started happening is that an economic crisis that started with these extreme drought events in the end of the 1950s basically generated a wave of opposition that was channeled by political organizations. Okay, so here I'm showing you just a simple bin scatter at the municipality level, in which we should look at how the vote share of the opposition increases in places that have more events of protest in the municipality level. So let me tell you about the data. So what we have here is the administrative data on the allocation of these ejidos for this long period from 1910 to basically the 2000s. And what we have is basically the shape files, exactly where the land was located, which year, who were the recipients, etc. And we have information on census data at the locality level, basically even finer than ejidos. So within each one of these land plots, we know population centers, and we have information there, and information on electoral outcomes from standard sources. So this is a map just to show you how big the land redistribution was. Here, basically, each one of these green dots are actually basically shapefiles or polygons, are land redistributed during these reforms. It's basically the whole Mexico. And here I'm showing you the exercise of going through local media, newspapers, and count the number of protests that they report in each one of these municipalities between 1960 and 1969. So what we're going to do is basically use this variation at the municipality level, either via like measuring opposition via protest or vote share of the opposition, and see how that affected the location of these ejidos over time. So the empirical strategy is quite simple. We're going to test whether or not the PRI forestall local state capacity via this ejido allocation. And in particular, what we're going to ask is whether or not the PRI granted ejidos farther away, precisely in the places that they start experiencing more political opposition, relative, of course, to the standard process of allocation ejidos over time. So the first empirical strategy is going to be a simple diff and diff, in which we look at observations here at the ejido level, so land plot, the distance of that ejido at municipality M and time t, and with the standard two-way fixed effects, but in a different setting here, we have municipality fixed effects and year of allocation fixed effect. And the coefficient of interest is going to be this gamma that tells us the differential effect of the distance of political competition on the distance of these allocated ejidos. We're going to see in this session that, of course, political competition and land redistribution are extremely highly correlated and be actually going in both directions. So we have an additional identification strategy in which we basically instrumented political competition based on these events, the droughts that occurred in the 1950s. Basically, the results are exactly the same. We solve part of the endogeneity, and the results are even getting stronger. OK, so to fix a bit the idea of the paper, I'm showing you here two similar municipalities in the state of Durango. Both have the same area available for redistribution before 1960s, similar shapes, similar context, political context, etc. The only thing that changes is that one of those municipalities faced higher political competitions and the other does not. And we see what happens with the average distance of allocated ejidos after 1960. So if you look at what happened in the bottom right corner, you see that the allocation of those ejidos ended up being really far away from the municipality heads. Versus what happened in places with low competition, the average distance is almost the same. If anything, even smaller. So the idea here is the following. So you need to understand basically what is the layer of the administrative divisions here. So we're going to have here basically the state level, inside states, municipalities, and within municipalities, ejidos. But within ejidos, we have basically the localities where population was actually distributed within the ejidos. And here, the issue now is how can we compute the distance from these ejidos to the municipality head? So what we're going to do is an approximation that is calculate the average populated weighted distance from these localities within that ejido to the municipality head. So in this case, this ejido has two localities, two different distances. We compute the average of those two distances based on how many people there were in each one of the localities. Of course, you may say, OK, but this Euclidean distance is not the best approximations. There are like geographical boundaries, etc. So what we're going to have here is basically different measures that accounting for geography or take into account roads, etc. So the first piece of evidence that I want to show you is that this distance is actually correlated with lower state capacity. And in particular, if you look at what happens across two different censuses in 1990s and in 2000s, if you look at the distance from the ejidos, from the localities that are within these ejidos to the municipality headquarters and correlate that with basic provision of public goods, you see that the correlation is negative and significant. So the farther you are, the less likely that you have pipe water, drainage, electricity, and less schools, which is not surprising in a way, but tells us something about how the decision of the allocation of the ejidos might affect the provision of these public goods. Here's the main graph of the paper, and actually, if you don't listen to anything else in this talk, this is what you need to bring home. The idea here is that we run the Venn study comparing different levels of political competition across these municipalities, and we look at what happened with the distance of ejidos to the municipality head. As you can see, before 1960s, places that would experience high or low political competition were basically moving exactly the same. But after 1960s, we observed this increase in the distance of ejidos to municipality heads. So, and this is quite persistent. We try to look at after 1990s, but additional reforms kind of affect the results. But it's still, even in 2010, we still observe that those ejidos are farther away. Okay. So here, just in table form, column 1 is showing you exactly the coefficient, not in the Venn study, but in form of basically simple diff and diff. And the effects tells us that places with high political competition implies like that this these ejidos were allocated about 3 kilometers farther away. And if you take into account the potential endogeneity of political competition, we observe that that effect is even larger. Here we are instrumenting with the number of months that have experienced a drought from 1950 to 1959. Okay, so that's basically the main result of the paper. But you will say, okay, hold on a second, Juan Felipe. Maybe what is happening here is that the only thing that is occurring here is that, okay, you start allocating ejidos, you start close to the municipality head, and then you ended up allocating ejidos farther and farther away as time goes by, right? That shouldn't be the case across places with low and high political competition, but even then it could be the case that places that have more land available for redistribution were precisely the ones who experience more political competition. So what you start doing is like, okay, let's be a bit agnostic about it, and instead of having political competition interacted with post-1960, what we can do is interact with other that predetermined geographical characteristics and other things at the municipality level, even controlling for that, and we show in the paper, that doesn't affect the result. The second one, and related to the land availability issue, is that maybe what is happening is that places that have higher political competition or have like experienced more conflict, for example, that we saw this in previous sessions, maybe those are the places in which we need to allocate land farther and farther away. We look at that, and that's not the case. If you control for land available for redistribution of the stock of land already allocated, the results still hold. Other alternative hypotheses might be, okay, maybe people start protesting and requesting for land for ejidos, but if I want to appease the opposition, what I can do is give them like really crappy land far away, and that's it. I just deal with the dissent in that way. We show that there are no differences in land quality, that these ejidos are actually the same quality that are close to the municipality head, and the effects are not affected by that. And finally, you can imagine that it's just, what if I just having someone requesting for land and just sending far away and forget about them? We look at a heterogeneous effect by these insurgents and potential oppositions, like I don't remember exactly the name of the group, but we look at places that were more likely to be in opposition, and we show that even taking into account that, we don't have any differential effects. So that's basically it. So let me conclude very, very, very quickly. So what I've tried to convey in this very short paper is that despite the benefits that state capacity has, we cannot take investment in state capacity building for granted. This study basically unveils a theoretical and empirically potential pervasive effect of political competition. So this idea that if you let democracy run, everything's going to be fine is not exactly the case. We might not incentivize investments in state capacity. And in fact, what we document in the paper is that when you are in a context of clientelism, more political competition might actually deter rather than encourage state capacity building. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the paper would have been framed differently in a way we could just say, maybe redistributed land reform influences state capacity building. Yes, no, maybe if you consider political competition, that helps you to answer the question. So that's basically what I have prepared for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the room? Go ahead.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. So one small question, but do you, because you have a right-hand side, there is a political compensation. Maybe it's hard to, do some empirical analysis. But have you looked at any like political outcomes that are dependent variable? Because maybe you could perhaps get some sort of sense that whether it's kind of understand the tactics of a PRIs in a sense. So bullshit of a PRI, if there's an increase or decrease, I don't know, but then you can kind of, infer some sort of like strategy that the PR might have.
Okay, perfect. So yes, so just to say, there are like many papers on ejido allocations in Mexico and effects on political outcomes. The idea there is that actually what happens is that when you grant this type of ejidos, those individuals ended up being attached to you, and then the basic clientelism setting occurs. You give them land, and then they give you votes. That's how it basically worked. So here, the idea is like comparing with places that receive land, but they are not supporting you. And that's the whole story here, that given that you cannot manipulate the margin that they support you because are part of the opposition, maybe the only margin that they have left is just sending them far away and affected the comparative advantage. So it's a bit different. Definitely there are like a couple of papers that look at this political outcomes, that this was like a great strategy for the PRI, just allocating land to basically make these peasant communities attached to them. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
So speaking of giving land in exchange for votes, we have the next presentation by Lorenzo Casaburi from the University of Zurich, who's going to talk to us about the electoral effects of land reform in Italy.
Good. Thanks for having me one more time. Okay, great. Yes, I think very related to the previous paper. I'm going to talk about the electoral effects of large-scale land reform in Italy. And this is joint work with Bruno Caprettini in St. Gallen and with Miriam, who's a PhD student graduating this year from Zurich, going to Riverside next year. And indeed, the goal of redistribution policies is often to gain political support, and hopefully, ideally, lasting political support for the implementing agent. Now, as discussed earlier, in many societies, one important form of redistribution is land redistribution. Okay, this is done by revolutionary governments, but also in democratic countries around the world and across very different regions. Okay, so there are a bunch of questions that we try to look at in this paper. The first one is whether these policies generate not only gains in the short term, which has been documented in other papers, but whether these gains persist over time and why. And we do this in the context of the Italian land reform implemented by the Christian Democrats government in the 1950s. This is a context where basically the same party with a bunch of different allies was in power for more than 4 decades. And in short, we leveraged the fact that the reform targeted only specific areas, municipality in specific reform areas. And so we're going to implement a spatial regression discontinuity, or more precisely, combining panel data with a spatial regression discontinuity, basically comparing the evolution of voting preferences, of electoral preferences in towns just inside the reform areas, these are the red in this map, with towns just outside the orange in this map. Okay, and so again, in the spirit of the previous presentation, if you want to take one thing home, take this graph, which is the reform induced a sudden jump in preferences for the governing party, the Christian Democrats, an increase of about 4% out of a mean of about 35% in these areas. And this effect remains stable over time, which is very different from what we learn from the literature on redistribution and voting, like cash transfers, for instance, in other settings that show quite limited, time-limited effects. And in the second part of the paper, we try to explain, to look at potential mechanisms, okay? And we provide evidence that the land reform induced a number of clientelistic practices, for instance, the role of political brokering or patronage, and that this may have contributed to a long-lasting political exchange between the voters and the governing party in areas targeted by this large-scale reform in the early 1950s. Okay. So the literature, the paper contributes to two strands of literature. One is indeed the literature on the electoral effects of redistribution policies. Again, I'm just citing a few papers here. There's been work, for instance, on Mexico that has looked at the impact of, let's say, land reforms on voting outcomes. These papers typically use sort of staggered if and if that allows to look at short-term effects. Another nice paper is the one by Gonzalez in Chile. It looks at the effect of land reform using an instrumental variable for over 9 years. And our contribution is to look at long-term outcomes. And then we provide, we contribute to the literature on land ownership and clientelism. And actually, in some seminal work, for instance, by Balander Robinson or by Anderson, argues that actually land reform that gives property to smallholders may actually reduce dependency and reduce clientelistic practices. We find in this setting that the opposite takes place because land reform appears to have strengthened clientelistic brokers, and I'm going to, of course, provide more details on why this may happen in this context. Okay, so what am I going to do in the next 15 minutes or so? I'm going to talk a bit about the historical context and the empirical strategy, the electoral results, and then examining potential mechanisms. Maybe you won't have time to go through each of them, and you can refer to the paper if I skip something. Okay, so this land reform in Italy, so massive program, again, arguably the largest redistribution program in the Italian history in the 20th century, 1951, and then implementation, expropriation was basically completed within 3 years by 1953, and the reallocation was completed by the late 1950s. There were larger states above a certain threshold that were split. This was based on size and some measures of agricultural efficiency. And the goal, of course, there's another redistributive argument, an efficiency argument, plausibly, but there's a clear anti-communist goal, right? You should think that we are in Italy after the Second World War, and while the Communist Party has agreed to compete to elections as opposed to attempt a revolution, there is a serious chance that they may take over the country in the elections at some point. And so scholars have acknowledged that the reform had a clear goal to like an anti-communist goal when implemented. Okay? And again, there is, commentators at the time do acknowledge that this reform may have benefited Christian Democrats. The DC symbol is, I should have it somewhere, maybe. Anyway, it's called the crossed shield. And Fanfani, who is a prominent DC politician, says, in reform areas, the cross shield shines while the hammer and sickle rusts. Okay? Okay. And so the reform actually targeted mostly southern Italy, but we are going to focus on northern Italy for identification purposes, because we are basically relying on similarity on areas just inside and outside the reform areas. Similarity of municipalities just inside and outside the reform areas, and this condition holds in the north, but not in the south, and in the paper we go extensively through documenting, unfortunately we cannot use the south part. And we use, of course, evidence from documents and claims done by various politicians. That's not gonna go very far with this audience. And then we do a whole set of balance tests and pre-trends tests. I probably won't go in detail. The basic idea of the empirical strategy, right, is that we can combine spatial regression discontinuity, but we also have elections before and after. And so we can also use municipality fixed effects. And basically, we're going to look at the outcome for municipality I in reform area R in election T. Think of the votes for the Christian Democrats in a regression model that includes either distance to the borders, and we're also going to do polynomials in latitude and longitudes by treatment status in a multidimensional spatial RD. And the key coefficients of interest will be on whether the municipality is in the reform, and we are going to estimate election year specific coefficients to look indeed at the trend breaks using various bandwidths and robustness. So the key assumptions that we need are parallel trends at the border, okay, and lack of contemporary differential shocks. For instance, we don't want to have other policies that take place exactly at the same time using similar reform areas. We also show that actually towns inside and outside the reform areas are very similar in terms of predetermined characteristics. That's a nice to have, though not a requirement given the sort of difference in difference logic that we use. And so trust my words there, and you can refer to the paper to look at the balance, at pre-trends, and at other contemporary policies that take place around this time and are indeed are not shaped by the same borders of the reform areas, of the land reform. Okay, so this is a simple graph that makes the RD argument. This is the change in Christian Democrat votes around the border. The right is inside the reform areas, the left is just outside. You see a clear jump right at the border. And this is basically mirrored. The increase in Christian Democrat votes is basically mirrored by a reduction in the Communist Party vote share. Okay, it's almost 1-to-1. And then, this is what I showed in one of the early slides. You see that there is a sudden jump in the 1953 elections. Okay, and then this is permanent. This vote share increase is permanent until 1992. I'm going to come back to 1992, but it's basically when there is a major crisis in Italian politics that completely changes the political scene in the country. Berlusconi, you can think of something that people know. And the results are basically, robust to a bunch of stuff, different bandwidths, different order of polynomials, etc. One interesting thing is that towns that are just inside the land reform areas do not just vote for the Christian Democrats, but vote with the Christian Democrats on topics supported by the Christian Democrat Party. So in 1974, there is a famous referendum for the introduction of divorce that the Christian Democrats were, basically they were the referendum was to repeal a new divorce law, and the Christian Democrats were supporting the repeal of the law. And you see that towns in reform areas are more likely to vote along the Christian Democrats' recommendations, even if this is a policy that has nothing to do with economic policy, right? It's a family policy. I'll come back on why this is important when we study mechanism. Okay, robustness. You can refer to the paper, or in the Q&A if you have any question. Please let me know. Okay, so what are potential mechanisms? Right, an obvious measure is gratitude. As mentioned in the previous paper, I give you land, you give me votes. Seems pretty straightforward. We know from the literature on redistribution and voting that this type of gratitude is short-lived. people forget, people die. And indeed, one thing that we find is that in towns where the recipients were older, okay, and therefore more likely to both forget and to die, yes, we see that these effects, the electoral effects, vanish after a few decades. Okay, so age does not shape the intensity of the voting effects early on, but you should look, sorry, this is this second set of coefficients, the interaction between average age of the population in the municipality and treatment. But then you see that this takes over as the initial beneficiaries, again, are probably dying or something else. Okay. So the second mechanism I want to talk about is clientelism. So as I mentioned, there is an hypothesis that giving ownership will reduce the need for services and goods from governments and will reduce clientelism. But the land reform, and I think this is very much related to the previous presentation, doesn't just give benefits that are permanent or for free. And what do I mean by this? There are several elements that limited the benefits for recipients. Number one, land allocation was discretionary. We don't have data on this, but we have some nice anecdotes or archival documents in which the reform officials were basically looking at application and saying, oh, this guy's a communist, let's not give land to this person. Number one. Number two, there are restrictions. You get the land, but you cannot sell it for I don't remember exactly how long. And number three, and I think this is what we want to emphasize, with land, you need inputs, okay, like seeds, fertilizer. And these inputs were provided, in this case, by farmers' associations. And the farmers' associations had a strong political nature in terms of being affiliated with the governing party. The largest farmer association was affiliated with the governing party. And the same for actually health insurance. Farming households in these areas were receiving insurance through the same farmer associations. Okay? And so these discretionarity and conditionalities are actually well-known ingredients of clientelistic systems. And so we collected a bunch of data. I'm going to show you some results showing that in these municipalities, these political brokers became more powerful. Okay? And this may have facilitated a system of repeated exchange between voters and politicians. Because I get the land, but to get benefits over the following decades, I need to basically receive inputs or health services by these clientelistic broker associations. And so importantly, what this implies, and that's the hypothesis that we have here, is that the reform, this large-scale redistribution, induces then a system of political exchange on these other benefits. And so any effect on the Christian Democrat vote share that we observe, let's say, 3-4 decades after, compounds the initial electoral benefits of redistribution with these indirect effects of these other intermediating channels that are caused by the land redistribution. Okay, and so what we see is a compounding of these two elements. It's not a problem for identification if we argue that clientelism arises because of the reform, but it's a matter of interpreting the results. And so this is Coldiretti. Coldiretti is the largest farmers associations that was basically providing inputs and healthcare to farming cooperatives. Many of the parliament members from Christian Democrats were actually associated to the Coldiretti. And again, I can give some anecdotes. And we actually collected new data on a bunch of features of Coldiretti at the municipality level. We show that so there were elections on basically the boards of these local health insurance committees, and we see that in reform areas, using similar regression discontinuity arguments, we see that the votes for the Coldiretti candidates in these health insurance elections, the vote share for Coldiretti increases. And with a bit of back of the envelope, we document that farmers who receive land through the land reform are about 50% more likely to support Coldiretti health insurance candidates than pre-existing farm owners. So it's not just a matter there are more farmers or more farming households in these areas. It's a matter that these farming households are differentially more likely to be tied to these clientelists, to these brokers. Okay, and consequently, we see an increase in the budgets that these farmer associations manage at the town level in terms of revenues and expenditures. Okay, how much time do I have left?
We're a bit early, so
Okay, I'll go for 2 more hours. No. Okay, so then there are 2 other mechanisms that I want to talk about on try to provide at least some evidence for this idea that large-scale reform can induce clientelism. The first one is patronage, and these are maybe not the stronger results in the paper, so take with a grain of salt. But we do see that basically around the 70s, the 80s, as agriculture became less important, in towns just inside the reform areas, the land reform areas, public sector employment increases. Again, in some specifications, not in all. And it's well known in the study of the Italian political system that patronage through public sector employment was a major form of quid pro quo. And then we can learn something from what happens at the end of this long period of Christian democratic government in 1992. There is a big corruption scandal, the money pulite, clean hands scandals. The Christian Democrats at that point are split in many different parties, all with a Christian component behind it. Berlusconi wins elections. But that's exactly basically the shock at which point the Christian Democrats can no longer sustain this political exchange, can no longer say, oh, if you support me, then I'm going to provide benefits in the form of clientelistic system. And what we see that in these elections, where you can still vote for Christian Democrat parties, but after the Christian Democratic parties have lost power, the vote share for these Christian Democratic parties in reform areas goes down. Okay, so we see an unraveling of this political exchange. Okay, so we look at a bunch of other channels. Let me just briefly discuss without going through the slides. We see that municipalities in reform areas experience reduction in population, but this reduction in population actually takes time to emerge, while the votes for the Christian Democrat, the vote increase for Christian Democrats is immediate and then stable. So the 2 patterns do not seem to be related, but of course it could be that migration plays a role. Then we don't see that this reform generated large gains in terms of income, wealth, or productivity. There is, for instance, no increase in home ownership, which is a very crude but available measure of wealth over a long run. Also, we don't see much in terms of reallocation from agriculture to manufacturing. That's maybe a bit surprising. Again, it depends a bit on specifications, but yeah. And then we don't see more firms emerging or less firms emerging in these reform areas. Okay, and then the final channel is economic conservative, right? One argument is that by making people small owners, these farmers used to be tenants or workers, now they are small owners, you may make them more economically conservative. Okay, that's a standard argument, for instance, in the famous Ditella paper on land titling in Argentina. But so if this were the case, we would expect these municipalities to vote more for right-wing parties after the 1992 scandal, after the Christian Democrats get out of government. And we don't find that this is the case. Okay, it doesn't seem that these towns are generally more economically conservative. And in addition, remember, they were voting with Christian Democrats not just on economic policies, but on family policies, on which the economic conservative argument doesn't really seem to apply. Okay, so just to conclude, in this paper we studied the electoral impact of this Italian land reform that took place in 1950. We document immediate and then persistently stable benefits for the governing party who implemented the reform. And we provide evidence that potential mechanisms for these long-term effects concern the emergence of a system of clientelistic practices, including political brokers and repeated exchange between Christian Democrats and voters. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Lorenzo. Two questions. One is about migration. No worries. One is about migration. What if, maybe you mentioned it, but what if there was selective migration? So what I expect is that the share of migrants were exactly the type of voters that would not vote then for the Democrat DC. And the second point is that we are thinking here for per capita migration, but in a democracy, our vote counts one, but our influence does not. If you let an entrepreneur migrate out of a county, the influence and the votes share that he brings about with him or out of the county is probably much larger than if you let migrate out somebody that is not a public person. So that might help to account for your effect.
Maybe I take if there's any other question.
Can I? Okay. Mine is just a curiosity, just to understand. Hi, here. It's a curiosity, just to understand the sort of a local. This is a local effect, right? The specific regions. Like, what drove the policy specifically, like in these regions of Sicily, Puglia, right, Lazio, etc. Grazie. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question related to why these areas were selected for the land reform. I'm thinking about maybe these areas were selected because they had more official offices to make the registration process faster, and that could also be maybe linked to these results. Thank you very much.
So let me answer this set of question. So on migration, the answer to both your questions is the same, which is we observe for the first elections an increase in the number of votes, not just in the vote share. Okay, so it's not just that you can think all the communists are leaving, because that will lead to an increase in vote share, but not an increase in the number of votes. Okay, and this of course then fades because out-migration becomes so large. But that's what this right graph here does. You see that here. On both two, I mean, these areas are not equal to the rest of the country. These are areas with agricultural, high agricultural intensity, etc. And that's why we use this regression discontinuity argument. What we care about is that at the border there is no jump. I think that answers for you. So I can't give you. I'm not going to argue that these are random places or anything. But what I care about is that the specific borders we don't observe discontinuities in relevant characteristics, and on all the observables and pretrends, that seems to be the case. We can talk more. I think there is some evidence, one reason why. I mean, in the South, this was a much bigger deal. And you see much more manipulation. There's some data on initial plans on where the reform should be based on technical assessments, and then on the actual reform areas after politicians intervene. And you see large discrepancies in the South, but not in the North. Okay? And so, I can try to argue that this manipulation is stronger in the South and the North. You will not trust me, and then I bring the evidence suggesting indeed there are jumps in characteristics at the border in the South, but not in the North.
Yeah. I was wondering, are there any other parties to look at in the pre-90s period that might also help you look at or rule out ideology, maybe even at the local level, if not at the national level?
Not really, because there is a socialist party. We don't see much going on there, but it's really the two blocks, standard post-war Europe case. I think the ideology part, that's where the 1990s comes in, because at that point we had much more fragmentation. We had economic conservative parties that are not associated to the political exchange to the reform, and we don't see differential support for these parties in reform areas.
Yeah, great. Who are the candidates
Yeah. So these are farmers associations that are selling themselves as representatives of the small farmers. In practice, they are captured by a bunch of sort of notable people, large scale, not necessarily large scale, but very influential managers. And so a lot of these actually run as a candidate for the parliament. Okay, so it's all, I think it's a common story, which associations that claim to represent the people that then are captured by subsequent. Okay? I mean, not to say, maybe that's too negative of judgment. These associations did provide support, etc. So that still today they play a role with the agricultural sector in Italy, but the management itself is not a random member that runs this organization. Yeah. And we have exactly, so we have data on presence of these associations at the town level. We don't have it before the reform. So for those type of results, these are like a regression discontinuity. It's not combined with the panel.
Sorry, it can be redundant questions, but because if there's some political gains there, I thought that there could be some entry of the new candidates from this Christian party, or maybe the entry of this association, that kind of intermediaries. Are there this kind of change, or is it possible to look at that kind of output?
Sorry, what's the second point?
Second point is this broker, the entry of brokers.
Yeah, so we do see that these brokers become much more important. They manage larger budgets. They get more people that are part of the organization. We don't have individual level data on the type of candidates in these places. Also because we are using very local variation for identification, but the electoral districts are much larger. So it's not we can compare different electoral districts at the border, because most of the states will be the same electoral.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much.
So from showing no economic impacts, now we're going to go to a different situation where we will see some economic impacts. So Shuhei Kitamura from Osaka University is going to talk about land reform in Japan.
Okay, great. Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, thanks organizers for having me here, and thank you everybody for coming to this session. So my name is Shuhei from Osaka University. So we had a U.S. in this session. We had a U.S. and the next Mexico, and then we have Italy. So the natural concept will be that I'm going to talk about something about the Japan. We had a land reform after World War II, and then we're going to talk about this paper. Okay. So this figure shows the local GDP per capita in two countries, United States and Japan. So as you might, some of you might have already known, but between 1955 and 1973, Japanese economy grew at an annual rate of about 9%. Okay, sorry.
Whatever you want. Yeah.
Maybe it's better. Yeah, it's as known as a Japanese economic miracle. But the question is, what happened to the factor reallocation during this period? Okay. So let's look at the agriculture first. So the left figure shows the capital in agriculture, which shows that this capital in agriculture was nearly constant or slightly decreasing in the period, but after World War II, it's dramatically increased. And the right figure shows the employment in agriculture, which was nearly constant or slightly decreasing in the period, but after temporary increase in the late 1940s due to the end of the World War II, this employment in agriculture dramatically decreased. Okay. And what about the non-agriculture sector? So the left figure shows the capital in non-agriculture, which is gradually increasing in the period, but it increased more after World War II. And right figure shows the employment in non-agriculture was also gradually increasing, but increased more after World War II. This is a pattern that we see in the Japanese case. So in short, so in the period, there's a relatively abundant labor and the scarce capital in agriculture. But during this period of rapid growth between late 1950s and then the early 70s, there's a factory allocation and the capital labor substitution in agriculture. And as a result, the capital in agriculture increased. So basically, the capital moved from the non-agricultural sector to agricultural sector. But by contrast, the labor in agriculture decreased, meaning that the labor shifted from agriculture to non-agriculture. So we are kind of living in a kind of Lewis model type of world, but maybe the additional sort of ingredient could be this kind of movement of capital from the non-agricultural sector to the agricultural sector. So the question is, so what factors enable such a drastic reallocation of production factors and the structural transformation? And answering this kind of question will help us understand the underlying mechanism of structural transformation and long-run economic development. So, and to answer this question, this paper analyzes the role of land ownership in agricultural sector. So I'm going to focus on something about what happened in the agricultural sector. So property rights are often regarded as an important precondition for economic development, as maybe many of you have already discussed in this conference, I guess. And also, there are some empirical studies in the secure property rights and the secure tenure, including the one paper by Krauss too. But so the difference between the previous literature and this paper is that I'm going to focus on the more like ownership of the property rights, or the ownership of land, so who owns the land. Okay. So in this paper, I used a massive redistributive land reform in Japan, enforced by the Allies after the World War II, which happened between 1947 to 1950, as a natural experiment to examine the role of cultivators rather than non-cultivators owning farmlands in economic development. And so during this land reform, the ownership of farmlands was distributed from landlords, who were non-cultivators, who only earned the land rent from the tenants, to tenant farmers who actually cultivate the soil through compulsory purchase. And I utilized a variation caused by this land reform to estimate the effects of land ownership on technology adoption regarding the capital, okay, and out-migration from rural areas regarding the labor during this rapid growth period. And the main estimation strategy employs the difference in differences method. And to conduct the rigorous empirical analysis, I have digitized numerous paper-based sources and constructed a unique panel data set of municipalities. And also, I evaluate the overall effect of this factor reallocation and economic growth using a two-sector neoclassical growth model. But I don't think I have time to talk about much about the second part. Okay. So what I found. So during the rapid growth period, land ownership increased the adoption of low-cost agricultural machines, or more particularly, power tillers, okay, like a small ploughing machine, and increased out-migration of the young population to urban centers, where they began working in non-agricultural sectors. And the effect tends to be greater in areas with better access to credit, suggesting the collateral effect. In contrast, I do not find a clear evidence supporting other channels. I'm going to talk about it later, but this part is still work in progress. I'm happy to have some feedback from this for this point. And in a counterfactual simulation, I found that the relaxing production-related wages had a substantial impact on economic growth, but in contrast, I found that the other types of wages had limited impact. So let me talk a little bit about the background and then go to the data and then finally the empirical strategy. Okay, so land reform, this happened between 1947 and 1950. So the motivation behind this reform was that the Allies thought to democratize rural society by redistributing farmlands from landlords to tenants, disrupting the hierarchical relationship between them. Okay, and the procedure was that this was a compulsory purchase on behalf of the prefectural governors. It was a relatively low prices, so because of these low prices, the payment completed within 1 or 2 years. And importantly, this land reform is not the reform didn't sort of grab all the land from landlords and gave it to the tenants, but it's not a full confiscation. So landlords were able to maintain some of their farmlands, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this part. And the results, so the ownership of 2 million hectares of farmlands was redistributed from landlords to tenants, affecting nearly all 6 million farm households at that time. And many tenant farmers become owner farmers because of this. And importantly, so this is just a transfer of property rights without resizing it. So it's not like chopping each farmland plot and making it smaller and give it to the tenants, but rather it's just converting the ownership of this land, the particular land, from the landlords to the tenant who used to cultivate this same land. Okay, And this map shows the distribution of land ownership after the reform in 1950. So this blue color means that this is the unit of observation is a municipality. So the blue color means that these municipalities have a high share of owner farmers. Okay, but the red to yellow municipalities tends to have like fewer owner farmers. In the different words, it means like there's a higher share of the tenant farmers. So I'm going to use this variation in my main empirical analysis. And after this land reform, there's adoption, the introduction of new machines from the United States, and then in particular about power tiers, and there's a technological innovation race among the Japanese firms, such as Honda, for example, began. And for example, there's a notable kind of invention of this Honda's F150 that you can see in the picture, but this was born in 1959. It's an epoch-making machine and half the price of the previous machine. So there's a bunch of sort of innovation race happening around this period in Japan. And so because of this sort of innovation race and prices of the machines getting lower and lower, power tiers quickly spread out in the country, as the bottom figure shows. And according to Hayami and Kagoe, with the introduction of power tillers, it became possible for female or old-aged workers alone to keep on farming. So this enabled the young to middle-aged males in farm households to engage mainly in non-farm economic activities. Okay. And lastly, so around this same period, okay, there is a mass migration of young people from rural areas to urban areas. So the three metropolitan areas, like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, received a large net of immigration. For example, in 1962, about 20% of those who just graduated from junior high school and about 20% of those who had just graduated from high school in the countryside began to work in these metropolitan areas. So this picture, a little bit, cute picture, but the young people wearing school uniforms just arrived from the countryside greeting their new employers in Tokyo. So they started from, started working in this new, possibly like a manufacturing sector or something in Tokyo. So data, the period consists, is for 4 years in main regressions, and 1950 to 1960. And sometimes I include the 1930 as an additional data point. And unit of observation is a municipality, which is in terms of, it's a similar to county in the United States as of 1965. So the reason why I chose 1965 is that this is the most aggregated unit in the study period. Okay. And the data sources are the following. And as I said earlier, that because most of the these data sources, including the agricultural census, were not digitized yet, so I digitized it by myself for this project. And I also created the municipal boundary shapefiles to match municipalities across years. So municipalities in early years were spatially matched with those in 1965 using the GIS software. So empirical model. So as I said earlier, that I used a difference in differences estimation in the main as a main estimation strategy. So regression equation looks like this, and so the right-hand side variable, the owner share, is owner share when the land reform was complete in 1950, which is basically the variation that you saw earlier. So it's the map, bluish map. That's the variation that they used as a cross-sectional variation, interacted with the time damage. So then we kind of look at how this sort of cross-sectional variation had a differential impact on these across municipalities over time, okay, using this equation. So main outcomes are two. The first one is the power tillers per household regarding a technology adoption. And the second is the share of the population aged 15 to 90 years old regarding the out-migration. Okay. And to identify the causal effect, it is crucial that the treatment variable satisfies the DLA assumption, such as the Fourier trend assumption. And the key to the identification is a formula-based cap or the upper limits that affect the post-reform owner share. Okay, the cross-sectional variation. And importantly, the correlation between the pre and the post-reform ownership is only 0.25. So meaning that the variation between the pre and the post is completely very very unrelated. And the upper limits. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry proposed the upper limits for each prefecture P by using the following formula. So XP is upper limits, which has interact with some weight times AP. So AP is average size of landlord's tenanted farmlands. Large AK is the total area of tenanted farmlands, and U is the upper limit at the national level. So, but this the term in the first term is nothing related to P, which is the prefecture. So it's just like a weight times AP. That's a sort of a criterion used for this making the upper limits. So how did it work? So if, say, for example, if a landlord tenanted farmland is 1 hectare, and this upper limit is XP says like 0.6 hectare, then the landlord had to sell 0.4 hectares. So this is really the upper limit that the landlords could keep even after the land reform. And after determining the prefecture upper limits at the municipality level were determined using the same formula, replacing national upper limits with the prefecture upper limits. So therefore, the upper limits at the municipality level are constrained by those at the prefecture level in the sense that the average of the municipal upper limits in the prefecture should be equal to the upper limits of that prefecture. And later, I will explore this unique feature to the land reform as an alternative estimation method strategy. And based on the formula, so I included the variables that potentially affect the post-reform owner share, which are average size of farmlands, the area of tenanted farmlands, and the share of the agricultural population, interacted with year dummies as baseline pre-treatment controls. And in later analysis, I also included other control variables as robustness checks. So let's move on to the results. So initially, there were no systematic difference, but in 1960, the land ownership increased the adoption of power tillers in the top figure and decreased the share of young people in the population, according to the bottom figure. And the effects become even larger in the 1965. Okay. And regarding the magnitude, so taking the 1960 and the 1965 averages, so in average municipalities, 10 percentage points increase in owner share increases the power tillers by 17% of the control mean. So if this average municipalities have 100 tillers, then it increased to the 17 tillers. And decrease the young population by 2% of control mean. So if the average municipality had 2,527 individuals, then it reduced to 2,476. Okay, so that's the sort of magnitude that I obtained. And during this round of reform, there's an increase in ownership by like 30 percentage points. So that's the kind of magnitude with the Japan experienced because of this round of reform. And we can see this kind of relationship using the partial correlation regarding. So these ones show the power tier. So 1950, there's no relationship between the owner share and this technology adoption, but look at the 1960 in the middle figure, there's a kind of gradual positive slope kind of appeared, meaning that the areas that have a high owner share tends to have more power tiers. And this kind of pattern also appeared in 1965. And regarding the migration part, again, 1950 is almost like a no relationship, but in the 1960 case, we have fewer young people in the population in areas that have a high owner share, and this similar pattern also appeared in 1965. Okay, and regarding the mechanism, so we see two sort of outcomes, right? One is about out-migration, the other one is the technology adoption. So the curious is which comes first. Okay, so what I did was that I interact the main variable with the change in the power tiers between 1950 and 1960. So this variable captures the kind of the difference in the sort of intensity of technology adoption in a sense. And what I found was that in the second column, I got significant results for those interacted terms, suggesting that if there's more technology adoption, then it reduces this young people in the population. And I can also divide this, the post-dummy into 1960 and 1965, and I found that this significant effect appears for the 1965, meaning that so the technology adoption led to the reduction of young population in the next period. So in a sense that. And I also found that this relative agricultural wage started to increase after 1960, not before 1960. Meaning that the change actually was, so the technology adoption was not caused by the change in agricultural relative agricultural wage, but rather it is a consequence of this change. So based on these two figures, it kind of seems to suggest that this technology adoption came first, and then this out migration happened afterwards. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Thanks so much. Okay. So but still, there might be omitted variables that are correlated with the post-reform owner share. And to address this concern, I employ a different estimation strategy. So the idea is that the upper limits at the municipality level are constrained by those at the prefecture level, in the sense that the average of the municipal upper limit is in prefecture should be equal to the upper limit of that prefecture. So the very similar municipalities adjacent to each other across the prefecture boundary may have received a different shock simply because they belong to the different prefectures. So I'm going to use this kind of unique fact about Japanese land reform in this next the alternative estimation strategy. So the alternative estimation strategy compares adjacent municipalities. Okay, after making the pairs of municipalities along either side of the prefecture boundary, I ran the following regression. So this regression looks like similar to what we saw earlier, but the difference is that now we are looking at we have for example, like a pair fixed effect, meaning that we are specifically looking at a pair along either side of prefecture boundary, and see that if there is say higher owner share is higher for this one side of this pair, and how that's going to affect the outcome variables. And the first balance checks. So this owner share in adjacent municipalities is pretty much like balanced in terms of different types of principal characteristics. And the results here. So what we found was that although the samples were quite different from those used in the DAD estimation, this alternative estimation method yielded an estimate similar to those before. Okay. So it seems that this suggests that the estimate that we have captured even in the DAD estimation is pretty much closer to the causal estimate. And this is only the kind of suggesting evidence, but although I don't have any agricultural DDP at the municipality level, so this is the agricultural DDP data at the prefecture level, but this figure shows that compared with those have a high owner share, low owner share, the high owner share prefectures tends to have a high agricultural GDP per worker, especially after 1960 or 1965. Okay, so it seems that this technology adoption and sort of the capital labor substitution seems to have increased agricultural productivity. And there are a bunch of other analyses and also robustness checks. I'm going to skip this one. And the mechanism. So this is the part that is still work in progress. So there are possible channels, right? So which are not, of course, mutually exclusive. Compared to tenant farmers, so I forgot to mention, but so tenant farmers in Japan is a fixed renters. So the sharecropping is pretty much there. So compared with these fixed renters, owner farmers are more likely to buy agricultural machines because their farmlands are more secure, security effect. They can use their farmland as a collateral for loans, the collateral effect. And third, they are perhaps richer. And regarding the security effect, so I used these different types of the contracts that are available in the municipalities, but I did not find any sort of heterogeneity regarding these ones. The permanent tenancy is a kind of type of tenancy that allows the tenants to keep the same land for permanently. So I thought that it's going to kind of reduce its effect, but that had no significant effect. Kind of so this result suggests that there is no strong support for the security effect. So what about the income or collateral effect? So the income part, I used, although this is a post-reform data, but using the 1960 agricultural income data, I sort of divided a sample into two based on this, this agricultural income per farm household, and so look at whether this, high income areas tends to adopt more machines or out, let the young population out of the agricultural sector. But this is what I did not find, or even like I found the opposite results somehow. But instead, I found that this kind of story, consistent with this collateral effect. So what I did was that I used the share of agricultural cooperative membership, because at the time, agricultural cooperatives are like main suppliers of the agricultural credit around that time. And then found that basically there's a significant effect for those areas that have a high share of agricultural cooperative members. So only suggesting evidence, but suggesting evidence for the collateral effect. And because I think, okay. Okay, thanks. Okay, so, but, okay, though we're almost there. And then, but, so that's the first part. And the second part, I quantified the aggregate impact, but I didn't go into the, I don't go into the details about this model, but only the brief sketch. But so I used a two-sector classical growth model to evaluate the overall effect of, factor reallocation. So I have this, the consumers, you have this Stone Gary, very standard, the preferences, and farm type, in the farm size, you have a Cobb-Douglas, production function, very sort of standard, production function. And then using this optimization, for the consumer side and the farm side, we can calculate this, the wages for different components. The first one is about consumption component, and the second production component that comes from the farm's optimization, and finally the mobility component. So each component becomes one if there is no wage. So for example, if you take the mobility component in the last part, if there is no mobility friction in terms of the capital, the interest rate for the the agricultural sector and non-agricultural sector would be the same. So which means that the two denominator and the numerator is going to be cancelled out, so it's going to be 1. So that's so equation 4 is about capital, and equation 5 is the labor. And I calculated the sort of magnitude of these wages for each component, and I found that the production component, the middle one, is large, while the consumption and the mobility components are negligible. So it suggests that in the Japanese, the pre-war Japanese economy had more inefficiencies in the production sector, rather than like a consumption, consumers or like a mobility part. And so, yeah. So this shows the both model and data predictions, but overall the model fits the data relatively well. So based on this model, I ran a counterfactual simulation by fixing the production component for the most post-war period until 1965 and compared it with actual values. And I found that reducing the production-related wages increased the real GNP per worker per annum by 16% on average between 1947 to 1965, so which is quite big. And if the capital wage in agricultural production is only considered, it is 1%. So this, even this 1% sounds small, but this is translated into like 327 billion yen in 1965 only, and this is the amount almost equivalent to the total government expenditure on the land reform. And an even larger effect is expected by elevating the labor wage in the non-agricultural production to absorb reduced labor, which so basically, so I found that if you sort of elevate the labor wage in non-agricultural sector, then there's quite a big effect. So it means that if you sort of reduce the wage in the capital part in agriculture, as well as the labor wage in non-agricultural sector, if you elevate both wages, then that's going to have a highest sort of output increase. So to conclude, so this paper examines the effect of land ownership on economic development using massive land reform as a unique natural experiment. I found that land ownership increased adoption of agricultural machines, leading to the out-migration of young people to urban centers. And the effect tends to be greater in areas with better access to credit. And the counterfactual simulations show a considerable impact of factor reallocation on the overall economy. Thanks so much.
Okay. Question over here.
So, very cool. I love this. I just wanted
Should I answer first or take? Okay. Okay. So at least I found. So you're right that maybe in this out migration part could be because of the fertility change. So at least what I did was that I used the sort of balance in terms of the birthdays in a pre-reform period, and I found that it's sort of balanced. So that's what I did. But I haven't done this, more like post-reform, using the outcome variables and So I'm gonna definitely.
But it's a similar story, but both are.
Yeah, good point. So I'm gonna look at that one. Thanks so much.
Thanks. It's very interesting. So I guess in locations where reform happened, you said initial landowners were also keeping some land, right?
So,
in locations where land reform happened, initial landowners were also keeping some land, amount of land.
There's a land laws, and the land laws are
So did you see some technological spillovers from new landowners' plots where they adopted many machines to the remaining land plots where initial landowners are still organizing the land?
Like spillovers of the technology adoption among this neighborhood.
They were keeping some amount of land, right? Even in the reform locations.
At least I sort of control for in some specification, I control for the neighboring sort of owner share, and whether that's sort of neighboring municipalities have an effect on the actual municipalities, but I didn't find any sort of difference using this method. So indicating that there's not much spillovers in terms of the technology adoption and the migration.
In the same municipality?
Yeah, so like contrary from even the neighboring sort of, owner share in the neighboring municipality doesn't change the results. So it may be that there is not much spillover effect. That's.
I guess as a broader question, maybe, is there any way to differentiate between the sort of the new owners and the old landlords, and sort of the difference between those two?
Yeah, so, right. But one sort of caveat is that the landlords before this land reform, basically these guys are non-cultivators. They are not interested in agriculture at all, and they just got the land from the tenant farmers. So they didn't have a sort of knowledge about how they cultivate the rice, and it's probably hard to think that there's some sort of spillovers from landlords to the new owner farmers. But I will think about it. Yeah, how if there's possibility to empirically test it.
So we have a little time. So actually, I'm going to open it up more generally. If you've now formulated a question for one of the previous presenters, now you feel free to raise that at this point. Does anybody have any questions? Otherwise, we'll bring the session to a close. Will join me in thanking all the presenters. These were fascinating. Thank you very much.